Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining to this live session. My name is Hamid Hassanzadeh. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Parametric Architecture platform. Today our guest is joining us from London. He's Hanif Kara. Hanif Kara is a super genius structural engineer and he's a professor in practice at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And he's also the co-founder and design director of AKT 11, a London-based structural engineering. So if you just stay with me in a couple of seconds, I will invite Hanif Kara to join to this live session. And there we go. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Hello, my friend. I'm good. And how are you?
I'm very good, Hamid. Thank you for inviting me.
That's awesome. Thanks for joining to the show. And it's really great and an honor to speak with you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm passing the mic to you if you want to say hello to our audience as well.
Okay, hello to everybody who has managed to join us. Thank you for taking an evening or an afternoon out to come and listen to my friend Hamid and myself talk about the boring subject of engineering, but in an interesting way.
Yeah, the interesting part of architecture actually. If there was no engineering, there was no architecture actually.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, would you please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background and when did you start your practice and give us a little bit about the stuff that we can't find online out there with,
Okay.
about Hanif Kara.
Okay, so I'm of a kind of blended citizen. I'm of Indian heritage, but born in East Africa. So I was three generations African and then moved to the UK about 40 years ago. So I have this triple identity, which I enjoy a lot. I speak English quite fluently through that. I came to this country as an immigrant and worked for a little while, then studied civil engineering. And the first 10 years of my career, I spent in the north of the UK doing power stations, offshore structures, and roller coasters. And then about a few years later, came to London, and I actually only got interested in buildings about 20 years ago when I started, co-founded the practice, AKT, with two friends. So that's the history. And at that point, I got so interested because I was always fascinated, even as a child, on how to make things stand up. And there was a point at which I understood that once you make them stand up, you have to ask yourself why. And then I stumbled onto kind of architecture and the bigger questions the architecture have to ask or answer, and got very interested in all of that. So that's how I started the practice. I also could see that most architects were suffering, heavily suffering, because they were not able to build, and contractors and clients had lost some trust in them. And because of my own fascination and technical competence of how to build things, I was quite ready to jump into this gap and support them. So that was the beginning of the practice. And to be honest, I started teaching at about that point, but it also became quite successful very quickly because I had a notion that the practice should take a bigger interest in making buildings stand up and do the engineering and solve problems. And we were already understanding that architects were under assault from economists, anthropologists, sociologists, politics, all of these other things. And I had to learn the language of many of these people in design so that I could actually communicate seriously with architects and help them. The other thing that I also felt quite important when I started was never to hurt or wound an architect. So, how can you develop a pain that they have in order to make their dreams come true, but also equally have an input in co-creating some of the things they do? They're always the author. So that was the basis of starting the practice.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I mean, you worked with a lot of like famous architects, like star architects, with dealing with those super complex structures. For example, you worked with Herzog de Moran, you worked with Bjarke Ingels, you worked with Zaha Hadid Architects, you worked with Fosters, Heatherwicks. So there's a long list of like experience and like you've designed very super complex structures, but for example, we wouldn't see them like 40 or 30 years ago, or so that's because of genius structure engineers like yourself. So would you please discuss a little bit about this experience and where does this success come?
Yeah, I think that on one hand, the success is partly to do with the condition. 25 years ago, the digital was just starting. So there was a new technological revolution. Architects and engineers were suddenly thrust into the world of the digital. Equally, I think there was a moment then when there was a lot of claims and counterclaims about what architects can do and how you could design buildings better without them, and it's cheaper to do work without them. So there was a moment, I think, when we formed, when that was beginning. And then very quickly, we started to come out of the world recession. And there was now an interest on the value that architects can create. So I started to invest, because I started teaching at the AA at the time, invest in understanding the questions that we're trying to answer and also understanding the client's position, but always with the eye of an architect, the mind of an engineer, so that how could I solve the problems of economy and ecology and all these things for them. So I think the process that we go through, one of the conditions is not to have or even show your taste. So you can actually work with any of these architects and actually make them look good as well. In the meantime, they all are very bright people. The best architects are very good engineers, I find. And the best engineers have a good idea about architecture. And when these things came together, I think they were very productive. So one issue was to do with time. It was a good timing. The other was to do with the technical prowess and competence. So being able to go outside my discipline within my office to introduce methodologies and technologies, and particularly digital technologies, research ideas that would improve my own discipline of what an engineer does and how that affects everyone. So it wasn't just about making things stand up, waiting for a question, but also trying to frame the questions that the cities were asking, our clients were asking. So I've worked with many of these, and a lot of the work has been through that route, through international design competitions, which, as you know, and most of your audience will know, is the toughest way to win projects, because it is quite hot, if it's open competition, but even when it's limited, you need an extra bit. All the architects are brilliant. What is the extra they can bring? And I was fortunate that these sorts of architects, Zaha Hadid, Will Alsop, all these people that you mentioned, were bringing us in early to create the idea with them so that we could represent and sell together to the city and the clients how these things were possible. I think complexity was overdone. I think complexity is talked about too much, because I think the idea of being able to solve engineering problems and then apply other lenses to that, including design, which is color and aesthetics, it applies to whether the building is simple or complex. If you developed a way of thinking and a mindset, you probably do the simple buildings better than the guys who do simple buildings for a living. So I think it was that ambition and passion and that fearless curiosity to see where I could push my own discipline. But also, I think I learned at the time, a lot about what architects were being educated and how the education system was questioning itself. And so were the engineers. So I think there was a symbiotic relationship with changing disciplines and making a practice both at the same time, always making sure that you make money in order to design. You don't design to make money. I mean, if you could play those games, then you were able to convince even the patrons of architecture who weren't interested in architecture to work with us, and so I developed a lot of very good relationships.
Right.
I think the digital moment was perfect for me because intuitively I'm by heart and mind still an engineer, and I love numbers and patterns and calculations. But
parameters.
So the digital, parameters. I don't use the word a lot, but I like that thing, about that, and then we can actually create out of that. So I'd say that the success came from that. The other component I would say is that getting friends around you, so developing a culture in your office where everybody has the same curiosity and we can all fight and argue about how best we can do this. There's a lot of competition inside the office. And that chemistry, creating that chemistry, you know, I have a really good group, which we call PART, for example, which we started 20 years ago, that really accepts any kind of designer who wants to sit in that, to actually come in, scripters, artists, sculptors, to sit in there and actually help us reshape the city, reshape architecture, reshape ourselves. And that, I think, investment in terms of design research was quite an important moment for us. And we've held that all the way through the recessions. And I think that is part of the measure of success. I think those people, sorry.
No, continue, please.
I said those people help us to communicate better, because engineers are not good at communicating either. So this was a good way.
Exactly.
Over to you, sorry.
In most of the projects that you have done with these famous architects, was there a point that you just tried to challenge the structure, or have you been challenged by the architects? Or, for example, you just worked on the structure, so you said that's not possible to build, or you just refused the project, or the design changed, the architecture design changed. Is there any point of like this in your experience?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. And
because
to be honest,
we are as architects, we have been challenged too much, like by engineers, by structural engineers, by mechanical, electrical engineers, that this design is not possible to build, that this curvature is not possible to shape as a structure. Or so like engineers really are the saviors or the guardians, like saviors of the projects, like saviors of the architecture. So what was your reactions to this for these kind of challenges?
Instinctively, I would always reframe the question. If I was told, is this possible? We will always say yes, but, you know, this is what you will have to do to make it possible. And by the way, it might be ecologically not the right thing to do. It might be too far to span. It will be difficult to drive it to the site. So I knew a lot about construction. I would say that, but rarely did we come up against, I don't recall a project that we said, no, you can't do that. So when you look at, say, Azerbaijan with Zaha Hadid, which is an asymmetric cultural center, quite complex, very difficult to do, but we managed it. You look at the tower that we've got in Canary Wharf right now, which is a cylinder with a mirror. Most people would say it's very expensive, every room changes, blah, blah, blah. But to be honest, that kind of architect has already thought it through, and we just support what they're thinking. And then we can develop with our tools ways of doing it. And I think clients are willing to pay a little bit of extra when they get this kind of value. I think it's interesting because Frank Gehry always says that there's only 15% of architecture in everything we see, because 75% or 80% at least is utility. Now, I think utility is also resourceful and interesting. So you can make that part interesting. You don't have to limit yourself to the 15%, which is the best museum in the world. You know, you can actually still design great, ordinary, common buildings if you are a good architect. So I think that this question of ever saying no never came, and actually it's misunderstood. So I would say to you that, you know, working with David Chipperfield is sometimes harder than working with, say, Zaha Hadid's office. You wouldn't say that, because Zaha Hadid's office, actually the answer structurally is usually one. But with the people who belong to that other school, they know the structure, they know where the columns are, and they're working with light or the phenomenon in their world. And you as an engineer need to come to speed with that kind of thing. So I don't think there is a polar opposite of what's simple and what's complex. People assume that funny shapes are complex. I don't think that's the case. And if you look at nature, and many people have said it, there are more curves than straight lines.
what was the most complex structure that you have designed? Which project?
I think I would go back to the early days. The first two difficult projects were the Pheno Science Center, which I did, because where that was the first project where I believe nerve surfaces became structure. You couldn't define structure as beam and slab. Walls became partly slabs, slabs became walls. So this continuous architecture, which many label as parametric, began to actually play out in how you make it, in the material organization. It began to play out in geometry, it began to play out on how do you make it. And at that time, with the technical power in Germany, it is the most technical place in the world. The good thing was they were willing to give us a chance. We won the competition. The bad thing was they would always have 5 people checking if it works. Everything we said we could make work, they would be questioning. So I think it was difficult as a process because we were still proving ourselves at that time. I think similarly in the UK, perhaps a current project that's quite difficult is we're doing the Google headquarters with Bjarke Ingels and Thomas Heatherwick, which is the longest building in London, and we're on site with that. That's been quite complex because there are two authors, but also the client who is quite demanding, and a building typology that is quite difficult because it goes very horizontal for 400 meters. People assume tall buildings are complex. Actually, when you touch the ground often, it's much more difficult how it changes and the conditions. So I wouldn't say not any of these are frightening. We always like a challenge. We've suffered sometimes with being too ambitious, too passionate, taking too many risks. But so far, 25, 26 years, we've managed to achieve most of these things.
Brilliant. Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. So I will ask a question about but I will ask this one later about the influence and the impact of digital design and your work.
Yeah.
But before that, I would like to go to about your academic experience. You've been in Harvard, you have been an Aga Khan visitor, advisor, and a long time. You have a academic background, your academic experience. Also, you're running a studio called GSD Master. I will ask about that one as well. But before going to GSD Master, how does this academic experience has just affected your work, influenced your work?
It's interesting because they say that it takes 10 years to be good at something. So exactly. I think I was quite good as an engineer, a structural engineer, quite early, and I had to find other interesting things. So if we go to the Aga Khan Award first, I was fortunate enough to be invited 2 decades ago, 20 years ago, by His Highness the Aga Khan to join the master jury, and now I'm on the steering committee. The interesting thing is that organization and what it represents has been around for 40 years. So it has been around for longer than most buildings. It has a lot of history in ethics, how to make communities, pluralism, conservation, and most of all, in equity and ecology. They've been dealing with parts of the world that suffer from inequitable economies and ecologies for many, many years, many, many years. So for me, it was a magical moment when I was invited. And I'm fortunate that for 20 years, they've kept me, and I've learned a lot about the other sides that come from architecture, because there's a Western narrative, but sometimes the narrative of the Ummah and the narrative of developing worlds is not always recognized when it comes to mathematics or architecture, science or technology. So I've learned that through that it was good. When I go to Harvard, I think that's a similar kind of relationship. I've been there 10 years now, but before that I taught it, as you said, I was a professor at Stockholm, but also AA. And I found all of these as a continuing professional development, because students are the best critiques and they ask the most difficult questions because they are still learning, and some of them actually help you reframe and make your own development continuous. So I find it exciting and curious, but also at the same time, I enjoy, these students who become stars later in life. I enjoy watching them grow into our industry. Academically, I think it's the other interest is design research, because as engineers, we only do scientific and technical research, whereas architects have to do design research. And those aspects that span the distance between what is technically an answer and what is phenomenologically, say, a question by an architect.
Exactly.
This area of research is very interesting. And all these years, I said, I get involved with architects, I teach with them. I rarely teach as a leader. I don't teach architecture. I support the architects' agendas, and then I work with them in terms of how to create a pedagogy that will actually allow a collaboration. I hate the word collaboration, but a co-creation where we will actually form and respect each other's disciplines without becoming the other. So I never become the architect like some engineers, and I don't let the architect become the engineer, either. So we work together. We work together in school, and we develop this way of thinking and interdisciplinary thinking. And the last 10 years that at Harvard in particular has been amazing, because my colleagues, as you can imagine, go through Harvard, there are so many bright, amazing people. So these people touch you, they influence you, they're curious, you get mad at them sometimes, you like to work with them sometimes. So these things have been continually feeding back to the award, but also feeding back to my way of living and feeding back to the practice. So I enjoy academia, and I carry out a lot of my design research happens through that method.
Great. The word co-creation was fascinating. Thank you for mentioning it, actually.
Yeah.
So would you like to talk a little bit about GSD Master as well? What are you doing with this studio, and what are you trying to teach students out there? Because I've seen great structures, designs with timber, and you're trying to hire the knowledge and the use of timber and all platforms. Like, what are you doing with this studio and your aims?
Yes. No, I think it's interesting. It's a very good question. We noticed that everybody was suddenly making timber very fashionable. And Jennifer Bonner of Mall, who is the co-creator, in fact, the lead in our studio, she's the architect, and we built a house in Atlanta. She designed it for herself, and we found that the industry was not helpful when we were trying to build this. They wanted to put the price up, it was a new material. And we recalled that when steel and concrete started, you could trace the history that the contractors and the clients took over. Architects were pushed out, engineers were pushed out because of systematic thinking. So our interest in mass timber started with that difficulty in Atlanta, and we built it. It's called House Gables. And we both agreed that there was a pedagogical question to ask about this, and it should be a multi-year thinking, because all schools are trying to teach wood. The thing about wood is, ever since we left the caves and put a piece of timber across a river, humanity has been connected to wood. The problem is that we've been treating it as an old traditional material. Mass timber and cross-laminated timber is an engineered wood, and it's not made out of mature trees. It's juvenile trees. So it's a really sustainable idea, but it is not the answer to everything. Wood is good is kind of a mantra in some parts of the world to sell the product. So we wanted to run a studio that starts to ask the question about what is beyond the technology. How do you organize the materials of representation, design, aesthetics, and all those other questions? And this is going back to many in the past. If you look back at option studios, which is quite a common way of teaching, people have raised these questions, and then others iterate this question, and then suddenly it becomes accessible to everyone. You don't need an expert in wood. If you're a good architect, you can design in wood, steel, concrete, or anything. And that's part of the reason why we started the studio. The other interesting thing about the studio was that half of it was done live in GSD, and the other half in lockdown. So I think it's quite an interesting bridge, lucky for us or unlucky, it's a terrible thing that happened to the world. But we had to switch the way we teach and how we learn in that medium across this particular material. So we've started something to make it accessible to as many architects and engineers and anyone who wants to be interested in mass timber, rather than make it a special trace, you know, that if you haven't done wood, you can't do wood. If you haven't bought into the system, you can't do wood. You can find ways of designing through this material. So the work has really been quite successful, and we have a symposium on it next year. But every time I've done an option studio, it's been based on a question. So the last time I did one was with Lera Asensio, which was about waste in architecture. And that was about waste to energy plants, which, you know, as we all know, there was a competition in Copenhagen with a ski slope, which we worked on the original concept with the Ingels, for example, where utility buildings need design. You know, you need to put other activities, make them healthier, and so on. So all of these option studios, including mass timber, are moments that I find with co-creators like Jennifer in this case, an interesting moment, because it will shape both of us in the way we think. It will help our students. It will help other architects to develop an idea about mass timber. Exactly. And that was the goal. We have a symposium next year on this.
Yeah, I've seen, I'm following GSD Master, even on Instagram. You're publishing the critiques about the projects, the designs. The students are just, that's really fun and a great way to expose out the studio. I really follow and I love it, actually. And it's brilliant. So is it for one semester, or will you continue this?
At the moment, I think at the moment we did that as a simple studio for one semester, and then we will now consider whether we do seminars or further research, like we might choose a site in Canada or Africa. It's very interesting because, you know, I think we spoke before about my absence in the East, for example, where I'm doing a lot in the West, and I would like to engage with the East a lot more, with people like Sanjay Puri, Woha, who are all friends, or Andramatan in Indonesia, Seri Architects, all these people who I feel can bridge material, but they also bridge the East and West. So I imagine that there will be a way of smuggling, in a way, this idea of mass timber also to these other areas, in order to do what I really want to do, which is to prove to them that working with great engineers is a possibility in that part of the world. And I know many of these architects that I mentioned are interested, but they just don't get access to this kind of conversation. So the students decided to put it on Instagram, which initially I was nervous about, because I thought, well, you can't just publish intellect. You just can't, you know, as people would question. But they were proven right, because the next generation has the right to do it the way in which they would like to try and do it. So I think we were very encouraging about how you present your work, how you might actually present it to audiences like the one you have, so that we can engage in the bigger conversations around how you present our work and what do we do technically, how do we research.
Yeah, as you said, you've been worked a lot in the West and been busy in Middle East as well. Would you please tell us a little bit about the projects that you would work in Far East as well? Yeah,
at the moment, we don't have any projects in, let's say, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore. We won some competition in Singapore. We built the Shanghai Expo in China, but we've been scared of going to China. But I think Indonesia is opening up now. We're working on a couple of confidential projects there. We have built in India, and currently we're doing a very large headquarters there for Google with Alford Holman and Han Morris, the British architect in Hyderabad, which is quite interesting because we now have 3 Google headquarters. We have one in Mountain View in San Francisco, we have one in the UK, and we have one in India. And this is kind of a conversation about design and who are the future patrons of architecture. So we have that. I think I would like to expand more and think more about how to support the younger architects and the current architects of that part of the world and bring the next generation of engineers into that conversation. When you look at the work of Woha or Andra Matan, you know, it's phenomenal, but they don't get access to our side. So nobody knows their work. Once you go to Japan, it's the opposite. They're so brilliant, they don't need anyone else. So you never really get to work with them. But we're interested because we built Mazda. We're building the Sheikh Zayed National Museum with Foster and Partners, both with Fosters. We're in Africa, North Africa, just finishing in Morocco with Zaha Hadid, a beautiful theater. And then we're in Ghana with David Adjaye, building lots of buildings there. So we have kind of a cover of what I call some of my heritage. Plan. Yeah, yes. and places that we can add value. Of course, we need to add value to these places, but we don't have a footprint big enough, in my view, in India and potentially Indonesia, Malaysia, these places. I would love to. I spoke at Arcasia in Bangladesh last year, which covers a population of 5.2 billion. And I thought, what do you mean? It's so many people, and I've never worked with these people. So I think it's interesting that generations of engineers need to be given to them as access, because there are some brilliant architects over there.
Yeah, exactly.
The same goes for Iran and Turkey, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Brilliant minds in Iran and Turkey as well, but because of their current situations and the economical and even political situations, there are a lot of issues for develop such a project in these areas as well. But hopefully we will see maybe great minds working on some great projects in the future. Before going to my next question, I would like to get a question from one of our followers.
Yeah.
Okay. Before asking this, guys, please, if you have any questions, please write them in the question box down below. I will try to ask them from Hanif Kara. So Martin asks, who were your biggest influences during your university time? Or why you choose this structural engineering and engineering in general? Who were your biggest influences?
Well, my biggest influence was really to make the world a better place than we found it. So it was more a principle about engineers who can solve infrastructure, health problems. But later, when I got interested in buildings, of course, I looked at history. And Sinan in Turkey, the work of Prioto, the work of, to some extent, Sarinam, these three who were kind of structuralist, although Sinan was probably broader, he was also a client. They fascinated me. I went to Turkey maybe when I was very young, maybe 25, 30 years ago, and I couldn't believe some of the construction there. I saw similar things in the Middle East. So I would say that it changed. My influence kind of changed when I started to get more interested in buildings. In the early days, it was really Brunel, because Brunel was the engineer who solved many of the Western problems of railway and infrastructure. So I would say when I became an engineer, I thought I was going to be in that mold. After doing power stations and offshore oil rigs, I knew the material enough, and with geometry of roller coasters, I knew it enough to move into a different world. So that was my inspirations. I today still respect people like Arab, who I feel are the ones who synthesize rather than dominate with structure. Some engineers like to dominate, and I'm not in that world. I like to synthesize.
Yeah, great. I'll ask another question. Alex asks, let me just read it. Alex asks, from those architects you have worked, which one is easy to work with?
Oh, none of them are easy. I mean, that's what makes them interesting. If it was easy, I think they wouldn't come to me, right? And they are all human beings, and they're all proud. They all have ambition. They all have risk. They all have knowledge. So none of them are particularly easy to work with. But I would say that people do misunderstand, say, Zaha Hadid. They think she was difficult, but she wasn't. She was just interested in what she did. And I would go and say that about most architects, but I single her out because I think she probably had more influence on females in the world, but also since Sinan, probably one of the most important Muslim architects who really made a big difference to the world. So I wouldn't say to you, be afraid of, hard architects or difficult architects. If you're an engineer, get
Right.
interested in them, take the risk, be curious.
Right, exactly. So you're born in Africa, and what is your connection to Africa now? And what is the next for AKT 11?
Well, going back to Africa, the connections are still deep in that Albert Taylor, my partner, is a Nigerian as well. So he has origins, although he wasn't born in Africa, but he has origins and connections there. We do a lot of work for NGOs. You heard about the Aga Khan, but we've done schools in Congo. We've done school in Ghana. We've done some stuff in Congo, some in Uganda, North Africa. But what we're beginning to do, I think, is really, I went to speak at Indaba this year in South Africa.
Yes.
And I think we're spanning now the distance between the North and the South. So I'm interested in this continent, much like most other people, but for the different motivation. I'm not motivated on the fact that it will grow and it will be the only place we'll have any jobs and food. I'm interested in the culture and what they've done historically, and I'm interested in going back to Africa to build and help them build things, systems of education, systems of architecture, systems of construction methodologies, because I do feel that they need bottom-up support, and they've waited for far too long for the outside world to allow them to do that.
Exactly. So let me ask about during this pandemic, how did AKT 11 reacted to this pandemic, and what was the situation that you took as a response to the pandemic situation, like office environment, works? How did you manage to deal with the projects?
Difficult, because it's quite a big office. It's almost 400 people with so many projects.
How many people? 400 people?
400 people, yeah, almost. Wow. 380. So, and we have an office in Copenhagen and Cambridge now. So we had to respond fast to working from home, because engineers don't carry their work on laptops. They need hardcore software in the office. Exactly. So one of these things was, how do you get the software out to them quicker? We had issues of broadband like everybody else, when you work from home. We had issues of people with children, all the same problems that we read about on the internet. But a colleague of mine from Harvard put it very well, when she was speaking about this stuff. It felt a little bit like you're in the air in an aeroplane and trying to make the aeroplane at the same time. It's so difficult and so quick and so sudden. So we were doing all this for the last 8 or 12 weeks, and we're settled. And what's next, I think, is interesting, because, I've been thinking that there hasn't been a moment like this where you can immediately see the history and the past and immediately see a new future. Before, the future has come slowly, even when we're going through globalization or the industrial revolution. But the pandemic created this really big schism, very quick drop-off. And I think for us, it's really about keeping the real sense of eyes in the back of your head. Now you can actually see, because you've only just experienced the previous world. Exactly. So I think we're going and tackling this. What does it mean to practice? What does it mean to working? We have a beautiful office at the White Collar Factory. How do we re-engineer, rethink the way we will work in there? It's not going to be a simple answer of everybody works from home or everybody works from the office. But where I think the next question is difficult to answer is really what happens to the world economy. Do we rush to solve problems of the immediate future, or do we momentarily breathe and relook at our ways in which we've treated the world? The ecologic question, the next generation's question, the inequities, because they've all become stark naked in this time. We can see the impact we've had as engineers and architects. So I think for us, it's still a moment of questioning what is I don't like to use new normal, but what is going to happen next? What is going to happen, and how can you adapt quickly from the next
Exactly.
to the midterm to a better future. So that's what's the dream. We're already working on a few competitions from home already. So we have competitions, limited competitions, so the world hasn't stopped. So we're out there, we're open for business, we're happy to support people, and it's good to keep alive, because the worst thing that could happen is you begin to give up. And I think this is where our young people, we have very young office, average age of 28 or something like that, and 46 nationalities. So we have a mini UN in the office with the brightest people in the world. And I think we would like to encourage them to come out and reshape the practice, reshape what we do next.
Brilliant. If you remember, we had a discussion in Istanbul about the Uberization, and I asked about this question. We talked about this change of tech companies come to architecture and try to build some kind of a standard software to the mixture of artificial intelligence and computational design with architecture. And I mentioned the name, you mentioned the name Uberization, and I just defined it as tech companies like Uber, like Apple, like Amazon have just gone to the world of transportation, and they are changing the transportation industry, and it's not being changed by BMW or Mercedes-Benz. But we discussed a little bit about on it. What do you think would be the impact of joining the tech companies of the future or current tech companies in the architecture field? And will it be a big impact? Will they change the architecture field, or architecture will be changed by architects? What do you think about this phenomenon? Let me call it phenomenon.
No, I think that it would be stupid to be in denial about, let's call it the Uber effect on architecture. I think it's stupid to be in denial, but you have to say that buildings are not like transport. They're after agriculture is the one thing we leave behind. It's slow. The building process is slow. The construction process is slow. So where we will learn from them is how they speed all these things up, how they make it efficient and more economic. Because the other extreme about the construction industry is it is too slow in innovating, and therefore lags behind in the world and doesn't help the economy of any country. So I think this area of technology, and I think you have to say that it will take a disruptor from outside to start bringing in some of these conversations on our process and our thinking. What I think won't happen is that the big ideas still come from human beings. And I think architectural disciplines, when they're good, have an ability to synthesize things that most other disciplines can't synthesize about architecture. We can specialize, but they are a generalist. Architects are largely generalists, and they're in their discipline, they're able to take our specialisms and turn it into gold. It's like an alchemy. So I'm not sure that they will replace architects. I do believe that AI is very, very important, because the ecology that it offers in terms of what is possible, what is probable in the manufacturing world, how we can do things without humans, build buildings faster. We've seen it in China. This has to happen, but it does not has to happen at the expense of design. So I'm still very convinced that design has a value, provided we don't keep talking about the world of the design, but we talk about the design of a new world, which has to include in it the impact of Uberization. And I think architects and your younger audiences need to look at that. I think that design is still a fantastic retreat. It's a discipline that does change your life and other people's lives. So architecture is not going to disappear in that sense, but there is space for allowing other methods, other techniques, and automation. There's a lot of research work being done in AI. We know that in manufacturing and so on.
Exactly.
And I do believe that it's important that if We can use machines to make our buildings. Why shouldn't we? The humans could be doing other things, you know. So
Exactly.
I don't have a I'm not anti, but I'm questioning sometimes what other people do with it. You know, they will steal, and that's the danger of Uberization, is that
Yes.
they will steal ideas. They steal, PI. They steal intellectual property, and I think this is difficult. It's a difficult
Right.
conversation at some point.
Yeah,
So
right.
I'm a real fan, and I think your platform is one of these leading things that I always watch, because I think it
Yeah.
does start to address this question before many others. Which
Yeah,
I
thank you.
congratulate you on this. Yeah.
What do you think about our platform, with our interviews, with the knowledge that we're trying to expose out about the future of architecture, and the tools that we are trying to bring into the architecture?
I think it's fabulous. It's an incredibly generous resource. The thing that I feel it gives more than anything is access and intelligence. The other side to it is it's ubiquitous. So it has a lot of material. And where I think it needs to be making a distinction is between what we imagine and what we can do and should do against image. Because some of these projects are image. You can't do them.
Exactly.
You can't build them. You will never. Why would you do it? So I think one benefit that we will get from platforms like yours is the idea of how you separate and make this distinction, so you can separate the number of likes from somebody who's actually making real difference. And there are many on your platform. I'm so pleased that we don't know projects until we see them on your platform sometimes. It's wonderful. What I can't imagine is a whole city being made out of all the projects you have on your platform. That would be an ugly city. It would be an ugly city. Right. So I think there's room for research with it. I would encourage you. I would love to support you. You should create a panel that actually creates a research project from your platform.
Exactly.
That actually looks at its impact and how to make distinctions between what's good and bad, what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. And it's not always the loudest people that have the best ideas. So, you can learn from this kind of research and thinking. But ultimately, I think that it is fantastic for the next generation, particularly in the places they can't access us and the conversation. Even I told you, I watched my friends, Sanjay Puri, Richard, and Michelle Roshin, and I discovered we both play a guitar. This is something I didn't know. So all these kind of things are really human in through your kind of platform. So I would encourage you to continue and be. Now that it is so good, you need to be a little more scrutinous. So scrutinize what you are looking at. Don't just post it straight away. That would be useful.
We're exactly doing the same. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, you can continue.
Yeah, no, I think that there is more in this space. I think there is more in separating image from reality, and there is more in, and I think this is a threat that's bigger than Uber, in the sense that if the architects cannot get hold of what they actually do, at the moment many of them separate themselves from being artists to being design architect to executive. So the world of architecture has kind of become a fragmented slice of bread, with different slices. Whereas if you look back at Sinan and the people we've talked about when I was in Istanbul, these people were capable of bringing us all together and creating a much better piece of architecture, and not buildings. I mean, Frank Gehry says this: there's a difference between a building and architecture. And he's right. I think we have to look at those kind of things that might come out of the new technologies, new ways of communicating architecture. I think there is space, and your platform will get us access to some of those people.
Appreciate that. With all those experiences, like as a closer, with all those experiences in practice and academia and competitions, like in awards, a lot of stuff. What kind of advice would you like to share with young generation of architects or designers or students or the future architects
Well,
or
I would,
engineers as well?
yeah. No, I think, one piece of advice I would give you is it's a long game. Don't expect to be quick just because you got 5,000 likes and everybody's following you. You have to
Exactly.
build. So we are judged by what we've built. So get something built as soon as you can. Write and intellectualize your work because it is important. You can't just build, right? Think about that. So that would be two pieces of advice. The other advice I would give you is be fearless and curious, because if you can't do that when you're young, it gets harder when you're old. It gets very difficult. So you can take risks, measured risks. The sooner you do that, the better, because you will learn how to deal with that. You'll deal with those problems very, very quickly. And I think that the other is that accept it as a forever way of life rather than a job. Because I think design, unlike many disciplines, you can't go home and forget about it. There are many disciplines, you count the numbers, you leave at 5 and it's done, nice spreadsheet. But what we do is, all designers and architects in particular, is a lifestyle. So if you're not interested in that lifestyle, leave architecture now. Go and do something else. You can deliver
Exactly.
pizza. You will make more money out of pizza delivery. So you've got to be careful how you put your footprints. But I would certainly say to all of you that looking back at my own history, with nothing to where I am today, is a very satisfying profession. It's a very satisfying lifestyle. And it's also important that the developing world or the East returns to this, because when you look back in history, it was big. And there were a lot of thinking about how they did their architecture, the Silk Route and all the rest of it. And when you look at some of the famous buildings in Iran in particular, and so on, I think there is also space in your own part of the world to do interesting vernacular stuff. You don't always have to borrow steel and glass.
Yeah, exactly. Brilliant. Thank you so
So
much.
that's all I would have to say to them.
Thank you. I was checking the question box, and there are a lot of thank you messages from South Africa, from Africa, from India, and they were all sending great greetings and love for this conversation. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say thank you to them, all my friends in South Africa, India, Egypt, Morocco, wherever they are. Please invite me when we're out of lockdown. We'll have dinner again.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining to this live session.
No, Hamid, thank you.
No, you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much. I will end this live session soon. So I'm looking forward to have you on this platform in near soon as well after the lockdown. So, so looking for more interviews like this. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you for inviting me, Hamid, and keep up the excellent work. Keep it up.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Okay, guys, thank you so much for joining and watching this live session. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to continue our interviews with architects, designers, and structural engineers in the future as well. So till another episode and another day, stay safe and stay healthy. Goodbye.